On a freezing winter evening, December 25th, 1991, the scarlet banner bearing the hammer and sickle descended from the Kremlin's flagpole for the final time. Historians would later frame this moment as the triumph of Western democracy, the defeat of Marxist ideology, or the end of the Cold War. But hidden beneath the political theater was a far more prosaic truth. If you had walked into the offices of the Soviet Ministry of Finance that day, past the mahogany doors and into the rooms where the real numbers lived, you would have discovered something shocking. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics didn't collapse because it lost a war of ideas. It collapsed because its bank account hit zero. This is the chronicle of the most spectacular bankruptcy the world has ever witnessed. It's the saga of a nuclear superpower that commanded enough atomic weapons to destroy civilization 7 times over, but couldn't scrape together enough cash to purchase a week's supply of grain. It's a masterclass in what transpires when an entire nation mortgages its future on a single commodity, and what happens when the market brutally calls in that debt. To comprehend how a superpower declares bankruptcy, we must travel back to the moment when Moscow believed it had struck eternal gold. The year was 1965, deep in the permafrost wilderness of western Siberia, where temperatures plunged to -40 degrees and the sun barely crests the horizon for half the year. Soviet petroleum engineers stumbled upon something extraordinary. They had discovered the Samotlor oil field, and calling it simply an oil field would be like calling the Pacific Ocean a pond. Samotlor wasn't just a discovery. It was a geological miracle. The reserves were so vast that even hardened Soviet geologists, men who had seen it all, stood in stunned silence when the first pressure tests came back. Here was enough crude oil to power nations for decades. Here was liquid wealth measured not in millions of barrels, but in billions. The timing couldn't have been more fortuitous, or so it seemed. The Soviet planned economy was already showing cracks by the mid-1960s. The grand promises of communism, that workers' paradise where abundance would flow like rivers, were proving hollow. Soviet factories churned out washing machines that broke after 3 uses. Soviet automobiles were so unreliable that owning one meant becoming a mechanic by necessity. The shelves in state stores grew sparse. Consumer goods were shabby, outdated, or simply absent. But suddenly, none of that mattered. The Soviet leadership realized they had found the ultimate shortcut. Why waste time and resources trying to build a competitive consumer economy when you could simply drill holes in frozen tundra and watch the dollars roll in? Why reform the inefficient collective farms when you could trade crude oil for wheat? Why modernize the decaying industrial sector when Western banks were eager to extend credit backed by petroleum reserves? Then came the 1970s, and with it, the greatest windfall in Russian history. The OPEC oil embargo struck the Western world like an economic hurricane. Gasoline prices in America quadrupled overnight. Europeans faced fuel rationing. Panic buying swept across continents. And through it all, the Soviet Union stood as the primary beneficiary of this chaos. Oil prices rocketed from $3 per barrel to over $30. For the Soviets, who were now pumping millions of barrels per day from Siberian fields, this represented an almost incomprehensible transfer of wealth. Hard currency, real money, American dollars, British pounds, German marks, flooded into Moscow's coffers at a rate that dwarfed anything the Soviet economy had ever generated through actual production. The Kremlin leadership watched the petrodollars accumulate and believed they had won the lottery of history itself. Leonid Brezhnev, the aging general secretary, presided over what seemed like a golden age. The Soviet Union appeared invincible. They expanded their military presence across 3 continents. They funded revolutionary movements from Angola to Nicaragua. They built vast new missile arsenals. They launched space stations. And most importantly, they used the oil wealth to purchase something that no amount of propaganda could deliver: social peace. But this apparent prosperity was concealing a fatal illness. The oil wealth was acting like a narcotic, numbing the pain while the disease spread unchecked through the Soviet system. The economic addiction worked like this. Because petrodollars were so easy to obtain, the Soviet leadership lost all incentive to address the fundamental failures of their system. Why undertake the painful, complex process of agricultural reform when you could simply sell oil and import grain? Why force inefficient factories to modernize when you could buy manufactured goods from the West? Why encourage innovation and productivity when the ground beneath Siberia was essentially printing money? The Soviet Union transformed into what economists call a rentier state, a nation that doesn't earn its wealth through productive economic activity, but rather extracts it from natural resources. They became, in essence, a massive gas station with nuclear weapons. The economic structure looked less like a developed superpower and more like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, exporting raw materials and importing almost everything else. Consider what this meant in practice. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was exporting crude oil, natural gas, timber, and minerals. In return, they were importing not just luxury goods, but basic necessities. They bought grain from America and Canada. They purchased machinery from Germany and Japan. They imported consumer electronics from Asia. They even bought entire factories from Italy and France, having them disassembled, shipped east, and rebuilt on Soviet soil because their own industrial base couldn't produce comparable equipment. The leadership in the Kremlin understood this dependency represented a vulnerability, but the temptation of easy money proved too strong to resist. They used the petroleum windfall to construct an elaborate system of subsidies and bribes that kept the entire Soviet structure from collapsing under its own contradictions. Food prices were artificially suppressed through massive state subsidies. A loaf of bread that cost the state 1 ruble to produce was sold in stores for 20 kopecks. The difference came from oil money. Housing was essentially free, with workers paying nominal rent that barely covered building maintenance. Again, oil revenues filled the gap. Energy was so heavily subsidized that Russian citizens paid almost nothing for electricity and heat, even as winters raged and buildings consumed enormous amounts of power. Beyond the domestic subsidies, the Soviet Union was bankrolling an entire empire. They propped up communist regimes in Eastern Europe, sending them cheap oil and gas, while accepting inferior manufactured goods in return. They maintained military bases across the globe. They funded Cuba's economy almost entirely, pouring billions into keeping Castro's regime afloat. They supported Vietnam, North Korea, Ethiopia, and a dozen other client states, all of which depended on Soviet aid to survive. The military expenditure alone was staggering, consuming somewhere between 15 and 20% of the entire Soviet GDP. Some Western analysts believe the true figure was even higher, possibly approaching 25%. The Soviets maintained the world's largest standing army, built aircraft carriers and submarines, developed sophisticated missile systems, and raced to match America's every military innovation. All of this spending, every subsidy, every foreign aid package, every military program, rested on a single assumption: that the price of oil would remain high forever. The entire stability of the Soviet superpower was essentially a bet on commodity prices. As long as crude oil traded above $30 per barrel, the system worked. The subsidies could continue. The empire could be maintained. The illusion of Soviet prosperity could be sustained. But betting your civilization on the commodity markets is like building a palace on a foundation of ice. It looks solid until the temperature changes. While oil was masking the Soviet Union's economic problems, another crisis was brewing, one that would prove just as fatal. The Soviet Union, which controlled some of the richest farmland on the planet, couldn't feed its own population. This wasn't a problem of natural resources or climate. Ukraine alone, often called the breadbasket of Europe, possessed soil so fertile that anything would grow. The Black Earth region contains some of the most productive agricultural land in the world. Russia's vast territories stretched across multiple climate zones, offering potential for diverse crop production. The problem was the system itself. Stalin's collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s had destroyed the efficiency of Soviet farming. Individual peasant farms, which had fed Russia for centuries, were abolished. Millions of farmers were forcibly relocated to massive collective farms, where they worked for the state rather than themselves. The result was predictable: productivity collapsed. By the 1970s and 80s, Soviet agriculture was a dark comedy of inefficiency. Collective farm workers had no incentive to work hard because they received the same pay regardless of output. Equipment was poorly maintained. Fertilizer was misapplied or wasted. Storage facilities were inadequate. Transportation was chaotic. The waste was astronomical. It's estimated that 30 to 40% of the Soviet harvest never reached consumers. Potatoes rotted in fields because there weren't enough trucks to transport them. Grain spoiled in storage facilities because the buildings leaked. Vegetables froze in transit because refrigerated transport was lacking. Fruits perished on trains that arrived weeks late. Even the food that did reach stores was often barely edible. Soviet bread was notorious for being mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. Meat was so scarce that jokes spread. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. When meat did appear, people would queue for hours, buying whatever they could regardless of quality. Faced with this agricultural disaster, the Soviet leadership made a choice that would seal their fate. They decided to import grain on a massive scale. And who was the primary supplier? Their ideological enemy, the United States of America. Starting in the early 1970s, the Soviet Union began purchasing millions of tons of wheat, corn, and soybeans from American farmers. The irony was almost poetic. The communist superpower that promised to bury capitalism was dependent on capitalist agriculture to feed its citizens. The nation that mocked American imperialism was sending ships to American ports to load grain. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending close to half of its hard currency earnings just on food imports. Think about that. Half of all the dollars they earned from selling oil and gas was immediately spent buying wheat and corn. They were, in effect, trading petroleum for potatoes, crude oil for cattle feed. This created a vicious dependency cycle. The Soviets sold oil to the West, used those dollars to buy grain from the West, fed their population with that grain, and then went back to selling more oil. The entire arrangement was precarious, sustainable only as long as oil prices remained high enough to cover the grain bills with money left over for everything else. The Soviet leadership looked at this situation and convinced themselves it was manageable. They had enough oil reserves to last generations. The price of oil had been rising for over a decade. Western banks were falling over themselves to loan money to Moscow. What could possibly go wrong? They were about to find out that economic gravity applies even to superpowers. March 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev, age 54, becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party. He's the youngest Soviet leader in decades, energetic, articulate, and acutely aware that the system is stagnating. He looks around at the Soviet economy and sees factories producing obsolete goods, stores with empty shelves, and a population that has lost faith in communist promises. But here's what Gorbachev didn't fully understand. The Soviet Union wasn't suffering from a temporary illness that could be cured with reforms. It was in the terminal stages of economic cancer, and the tumor was metastasizing fast. Gorbachev announced his vision for the future, perestroika, meaning restructuring. He wanted to modernize Soviet industry, invest heavily in technology and machine building, and somehow make the Soviet economy competitive with the West without abandoning socialism. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps even a noble one. It was also going to be extraordinarily expensive. To finance perestroika, Gorbachev looked at the budget and made assumptions based on recent history. Oil revenues had been strong for 15 years. They would surely continue. The budget could support massive investment in modernization while maintaining all the existing subsidies and military spending. The math, at least on paper, seemed to work. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about commodity markets. On September 13, 1985, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the Saudi Arabian oil minister, made an announcement that would change history. He declared that Saudi Arabia was done playing the role of swing producer, sacrificing its own market share to keep prices elevated. The kingdom was going to open its oil spigots and flood the market. The Saudis had their reasons. They were frustrated with other OPEC members cheating on production quotas. They wanted to discipline competitors who had been undercutting them. And there's evidence they coordinated with the United States, which had its own motivations for crushing oil prices, including the desire to hurt the Soviet economy. Whatever the complete mix of motivations, the result was catastrophic for Moscow. Saudi Arabia unleashed a tidal wave of crude oil onto global markets. Prices didn't just fall, they collapsed with shocking speed. In 1980, oil had traded at $35 per barrel. By early 1986, it had plummeted to below $10 per barrel. Some contracts briefly touched $8. The petroleum market had been decimated. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't just an economic setback. It was an existential crisis. In the span of less than a year, Soviet hard currency income was cut in half. Imagine if you woke up tomorrow and discovered that half your annual salary had vanished, but your mortgage payment, car loan, credit card bills, and grocery expenses remained exactly the same. That's the situation the Soviet government faced, except on a scale of tens of billions of dollars. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Soviet Union was deeply entrenched in Afghanistan, fighting a brutal guerrilla war that was consuming money, equipment, and lives at an alarming rate. They were sending perhaps $3 to $4 billion annually into that quagmire. They were still subsidizing communist regimes around the world, from Cuba to Angola to Vietnam. They were trying to maintain nuclear parity with the United States, which under Reagan was embarking on an expensive military buildup, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, mockingly called Star Wars. And they still had to buy the grain. The ships were arriving at Soviet ports every week, loaded with American wheat, and the captains demanded payment in hard currency. You couldn't pay them in rubles. The Soviet ruble was what economists call a soft currency, meaning it had no value outside the Soviet Union. You couldn't take rubles to a bank in New York or London and exchange them for dollars or pounds. The ruble was essentially monopoly money beyond Soviet borders. Faced with this crisis, Gorbachev had to make impossible choices. He could slash military spending, but the generals would rebel, and the military was the ultimate source of Soviet power. He could cut food subsidies, but that risked social unrest and even riots. He could abandon the client states, but that would be admitting defeat in the Cold War. So he chose a different path: debt. The Soviet Union began borrowing on an unprecedented scale. Western banks were more than happy to lend money to the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. After all, this was a superpower with vast natural resources, nuclear weapons, and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Superpowers don't go bankrupt. That's what everyone thought. German banks, French banks, British banks, and American banks opened their vaults. The Soviet Union took out loan after loan, billion after billion. Their debt, which had been essentially zero in the early 1980s, began growing at a frightening pace. But here's the critical detail: this wasn't investment capital. When a country borrows money to build infrastructure, factories, or power plants, that's potentially productive debt. The borrowed money creates assets that generate returns, which can then be used to pay back the loans with interest. The Soviet Union wasn't borrowing for investment. They were borrowing for consumption. The loans were used to buy food imports, consumer goods, and basic supplies to keep the shelves from being completely bare. They were borrowing to eat, to heat homes, to maintain the illusion of normalcy. This is the death spiral of debt. When you borrow for consumption rather than investment, you're not creating any capacity to repay the loan. You're just delaying the crisis while making it worse. It's like putting your grocery bill on a credit card every month while unemployed. Eventually, the card maxes out, and then what? To make matters dramatically worse, Gorbachev made a well-intentioned domestic policy decision that accelerated the financial hemorrhaging. In 1985, he launched an anti-alcohol campaign. The problem Gorbachev identified was real. Alcoholism was epidemic in the Soviet Union. The average Soviet citizen consumed the equivalent of 15 liters of pure alcohol per year, one of the highest rates in the world. Vodka was destroying families, killing workers through accidents and disease, and undermining productivity across the economy. So Gorbachev did what seemed morally right. He restricted vodka sales, limited production, destroyed vineyards, and made it much harder to purchase alcohol legally. From a public health perspective, it made sense. From a fiscal perspective, it was economic suicide. The state monopoly on alcohol sales was one of the largest revenue sources for the Soviet government, second only to oil exports. Vodka taxes had been filling government coffers for generations. By curtailing alcohol sales, Gorbachev eliminated another massive stream of revenue, just as the oil money was evaporating. And the people didn't stop drinking. Russians simply started brewing moonshine at home using sugar, potatoes, and anything else they could ferment. So the state got zero revenue while illegal distilling exploded. Sugar vanished from store shelves because everyone was buying it to make samagon, homemade vodka. The black market in alcohol became enormous. By 1987 and 1988, the Soviet fiscal situation was spiraling into chaos. The budget deficit was ballooning. Revenue was collapsing from both the oil crash and the alcohol restrictions. Expenses remained astronomical. The loans from Western banks were now being used to pay interest on previous loans, a classic sign of impending default. The government began resorting to the last, desperate tool of failed states: printing money. The Soviet Central Bank fired up the printing presses and began churning out rubles to pay workers' salaries, fund government operations, and maintain the subsidies. But printing money when there are no goods to buy is like pouring gasoline on a fire. The rubles flooded the economy, but there was nothing to purchase with them. This created what economists call a monetary overhang: enormous amounts of currency chasing a tiny supply of goods. The result was the full manifestation of the shortage economy. Store shelves emptied completely. Queues became a way of life. People would see a line forming and join it without even asking what was being sold, because if there was a queue, it meant something, anything, was available. It might be shoes, sausages, soap, or toilet paper. You grabbed whatever you could because tomorrow it would be gone. The Soviet citizens' daily life became a constant hunt for basic necessities. Women would carry shopping bags everywhere, just in case they stumbled upon something for sale. People developed networks of friends and contacts who would tip them off when a shipment of meat or butter arrived at a particular store. Barter networks emerged. The person with access to car parts would trade with someone who had access to cooking oil, who would trade with someone who had access to medicine. The social contract between the Soviet state and its citizens was dissolving. For decades, Soviet people had accepted the lack of political freedom, the surveillance, the propaganda, because the state delivered on one crucial promise: stability. You might not be rich, but you had a job. Your rent was cheap. Food was affordable. Your children could go to school. Now that stability was gone. The jobs still existed, but the wages were worthless. The rent was still cheap, but often there was no heat in winter because fuel deliveries were unreliable. Food was supposedly affordable, but there was none to buy. And in the West, the banks were getting nervous. Financial analysts in London, Frankfurt, and New York began scrutinizing the Soviet numbers with growing alarm. The Soviet Union's foreign debt had exploded from nearly zero to over $50 billion in just a few years. The debt-to-GDP ratio was climbing. Payment schedules were being missed. New loans were being used to pay interest on old loans. The credit rating agencies began to downgrade Soviet debt. The supposedly risk-free loans to a superpower were now looking decidedly risky. Some banks started refusing to roll over short-term loans, demanding payment instead. The Soviet Ministry of Finance was caught in an impossible situation. They needed to make debt payments, buy grain, pay for essential imports, and maintain some foreign currency reserves. But the money simply wasn't there. Oil prices remained depressed. Internal revenue collection was collapsing. The economy was contracting. Then came 1989, and with it, the political earthquake that shattered the empire's economic foundation. The Berlin Wall fell in November. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments toppled like dominoes. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria all broke free from Soviet control. For the world, watching on television, this looked like the triumph of freedom, the liberation of oppressed peoples. For the accountants in Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had operated a closed trading system with Eastern Europe called Comecon. The Soviets would sell oil and gas to countries like Poland and East Germany at artificially low prices. In return, those countries would sell manufactured goods, machinery, and consumer products back to the Soviet Union. The entire system operated on favorable terms for Moscow, essentially allowing the Soviets to extract economic value from the satellites. When the Eastern European countries broke free, they immediately demanded to be paid in hard currency at market prices. They refused to accept rubles. The whole trading structure collapsed overnight. The Soviet Union lost access to Eastern European manufactured goods just as domestic production was falling apart. Inside the Kremlin, panic was setting in. The foreign currency reserves, those legendary stockpiles of dollars, pounds, and gold, were evaporating with terrifying speed. The Soviet Union had long boasted of massive gold reserves, supposedly containing thousands of tons of gold bars secured in deep vaults. These reserves were a symbol of Soviet strength, a backstop against any economic crisis. But in reality, the gold was disappearing. Throughout 1989 and 1990, the Soviets were secretly flying gold bars to London and Zurich, selling them in a desperate scramble to raise cash for the next shipment of wheat or the next debt payment. They sold so much gold so quickly that they actually depressed the global gold price, meaning they got less value for each bar they sold. It was a fire sale of national patrimony. Investigators who later examined the books discovered that the legendary gold reserves had been a fiction. By 1991, only about 240 tons of gold remained in the vaults. Thousands of tons had been sold, stolen, or somehow vanished during the desperate final years. The situation deteriorated further with what became known as the War of Laws. This was the final internal blow that shattered the Soviet state's ability to function. The Soviet Union was a federation of 15 republics, with Russia being the largest. As the system weakened, these republics began asserting independence. They started passing laws that contradicted Soviet federal law. Most critically, they began withholding tax revenue from the central government. Boris Yeltsin, who had become president of the Russian Republic, essentially declared economic war on Gorbachev's Soviet government. He instructed Russian tax collectors to keep the money in Russia and stop sending it to the Central Soviet budget. Since Russia represented the majority of the Soviet economy, this was devastating. Other republics followed suit. Ukraine kept its revenues. The Baltic states stopped sending money. The Central Asian republics held back resources. Mikhail Gorbachev, still the president of the Soviet Union, found himself in a surreal position. He commanded the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal. He had millions of soldiers under his nominal command. He sat atop a bureaucracy of millions of people. But he had no money. The tax revenue wasn't coming in. The republics were withholding it. The oil money had dried up. The gold was gone. The foreign credit lines were exhausted. How do you run a superpower with no budget? In 1990, the unthinkable began happening. The Soviet Union started defaulting on its commercial obligations. Ships carrying desperately needed food supplies would arrive at Soviet ports, anchor offshore, and then refuse to unload their cargo. The ship's captains would radio that they wouldn't release the goods until payment cleared. But the payments weren't clearing. The checks were bouncing. The wire transfers weren't going through. The Soviet government had to resort to begging. Officials traveled to Western capitals, hat in hand, asking for emergency humanitarian aid. It was a staggering humiliation. This was the nation that had defeated Nazi Germany, that had put the first human in space, that had built an empire stretching across 2 continents. Now they were asking for food aid like a struggling developing country. Germany, the nation that the Soviets had conquered in 1945, was now sending care packages of powdered milk and canned meat to feed Soviet citizens. The historical reversal was almost incomprehensible. The main Soviet bank for foreign trade, Bank, took an extraordinary step. They froze all foreign currency accounts held by Soviet companies and individuals. If a Soviet enterprise had earned dollars through exports and deposited them in the bank, they woke up one morning to find their accounts locked. The government had confiscated the money to pay national debts and buy food imports. This was essentially government theft on a massive scale. Any remaining trust in Soviet financial institutions evaporated completely. Why would anyone do business with Soviet entities if the government could just seize foreign currency deposits at will? The ruble ceased functioning as a real currency. The official exchange rate became meaningless. On paper, the ruble might be valued at 1 to the dollar. In reality, black market exchange rates were 10, 20, 50 times higher. The ruble had become worthless paper. The economy regressed to barter. Factories couldn't pay workers in cash that had value, so they paid them in products. An automobile factory would pay workers in tires. A glass factory would pay in crystal stemware. A clothing factory would pay in jackets. Workers would then stand on street corners trying to trade their payment for actual necessities. The black market became the only functional market. Dollars became the only reliable currency. Taxi drivers, doormen, and anyone with access to foreign tourists suddenly became part of the new elite because they could earn real money. Meanwhile, nuclear physicists, university professors, and doctors were impoverished because their ruble salaries were worthless. In August 1991, hardline communists staged a coup attempt against Gorbachev. They placed him under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea. They sent tanks into Moscow. They declared a state of emergency. They wanted to reverse the reforms, restore the Soviet Union's strength, and return to the old ways. The coup collapsed within 3 days. not primarily because of popular resistance, though that played a role, but because the coup plotters had no solution to the fundamental problem. They had no plan to fix the debt. They had no way to pay for grain. They had no strategy to restore the economy. They were fighting for control of a ship that was already underwater. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow after the failed coup, he was a ghost of a leader. Real power had shifted to Yeltsin and the republics. The Soviet Union existed only as a legal fiction. The Western banks and the G7 countries were terrified. The Soviet Union owed nearly $70 billion. If the country broke apart, who would be responsible for the debt? Would it be divided among the republics based on population? Would each republic inherit its share? The creditors demanded what's called joint and several liability, meaning all the successor states would be collectively responsible for the entire debt. They essentially told the fragmenting Soviet republics, "We don't care how you divide it up among yourselves, but someone has to pay us back." In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only in name. There was no money for the November payroll for millions of state employees. There was no money for the December payroll. The printing presses ran around the clock, churning out high-denomination banknotes that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Hyperinflation had arrived. Prices began doubling every few weeks. Life savings were wiped out. Pensioners who had accumulated rubles for decades watched their entire retirement fund become worthless in a matter of months. On Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at a desk in the Kremlin. He had been up most of the night, negotiating his resignation and the transfer of power. At 7 p.m. Moscow time, he addressed the nation one final time as president of the Soviet Union. He didn't resign because an enemy army had invaded. He didn't resign because of a successful coup. He resigned because he had lost the ability to govern. You cannot run a state if you cannot pay the people who work for it. You cannot maintain an empire if you cannot afford bread for your capital city. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rose the white, blue, and red tricolor of Russia. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics officially ceased to exist, but the ghost of the Soviet Empire lingered in the ledger books. The new Russian Federation, under Boris Yeltsin, inherited the Soviet Union's seat on the UN Security Council. It inherited the nuclear weapons codes. It inherited the embassies and military bases. And it inherited the debt. Russia agreed to assume 100% of the Soviet Union's foreign obligations in exchange for claiming all of the Soviet Union's foreign assets. It was called the Zero Option Deal. The other former Soviet republics were released from debt obligation, and Russia took it all on. This debt burden crushed Russia throughout the 1990s. The new democratic government was strangled by the need to make interest payments on loans that communist leaders had taken out. Every year, billions of dollars that could have been used to ease the transition or help struggling citizens instead went to foreign banks. The shock therapy economic reforms that followed, the sudden lifting of price controls, the privatization of state assets, were all conducted in this context of crushing debt and no fiscal room to maneuver. There was no money to cushion the transition. Subsidies were eliminated overnight not as an ideological choice, but as a fiscal necessity. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed by 2,000% in a matter of months. The life savings of millions of Russians were obliterated. Pensioners who had lived modestly but comfortably found themselves in absolute poverty. People who had middle-class jobs suddenly couldn't afford food. The poverty and suffering that followed were immense. But it's crucial to understand that this wasn't caused by the collapse in 1991. It was caused by the addiction to easy oil money in the 1970s. The pain of the 1990s was the withdrawal symptom from the petroleum high of the previous decades. Russia struggled for years to climb out of the hole. In 1998, they defaulted again, this time on domestic debt, triggering a global financial crisis. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when oil prices began rising again, that Russia could finally clear its Soviet-era obligations. In 2017, Russia made its final payment on Soviet debt, a sum owed to Bosnia and Herzegovina. 26 years after the Soviet flag came down, the last line item in the Soviet Union's account books was finally closed. The fall of the Soviet Union stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of what economists call the resource curse. It demonstrates that natural resource wealth is not the same as economic strength. The Soviets made a fatal error. They confused a fortunate geological accident with economic genius. Because oil and gas flowed from beneath Siberia, they believed they were wealthy. But they weren't wealthy. They were merely lucky. And luck runs out. The petroleum windfall allowed them to avoid addressing fundamental problems. Their agriculture was inefficient. Buy grain with oil money. Their consumer goods were inferior. Import them with oil money. Their client states were economic basket cases. Support them with oil money. Their military consumed too much of the economy. Pay for it with oil money. Everything was built on the assumption that oil prices would remain high. When that assumption proved false, the entire structure collapsed. Here's the core lesson. A nation that cannot produce what its people need is not truly strong, no matter how many nuclear weapons it possesses. An empire that depends on commodity markets is an empire at the mercy of forces beyond its control. A superpower that must import its daily bread is not a superpower at all. It's a house of cards waiting for the wind to blow. The Cold War is often portrayed as an ideological struggle, and on one level it was. But it was also an economic contest. And in that contest, the Soviet Union lost not because democracy beat communism in the realm of ideas, but because a diversified, productive economy beat a petrostate dependent on a single commodity. The final irony is this. The Soviet Union collapsed because of wheat, not because of missiles, not because of spies, not because of speeches or summits. They collapsed because they couldn't afford to buy the grain to feed their people. The hammer and sickle didn't fall to American tanks. It fell to American farmers. If you want to understand power in the modern world, don't just count the nuclear warheads. Look at the balance sheet. Follow the money. Because in the end, empires that cannot balance their books are empires on borrowed time. And time always comes to collect its debt. If you found this deep dive into hidden economic history fascinating, make sure to subscribe. Because when the next great power makes the same mistakes, you'll want to be among the few who can see it coming before it hits the headlines.